Hello, hi.
Hi.
Hi. Give it a couple minutes here for folks to join. Give it just another minute since people are still joining. All right, it's 2 minutes past the hour. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm dropping a link into the Zoom chat just as a reminder for the meeting minutes. I see a couple of you are already in there for sure. If the others could go ahead and put their name in there, just so we can keep track a bit of who's been in attendance, that would be useful. So first of all, welcome. I see quite a few names who were not in yesterday's meeting, which is perfect. This is why we're having this meeting, to make it a little easier in time zone for folks. So welcome. As I discussed last week, I want to try to figure out a way to make both of these meetings constructive and unique, as opposed to just having a repeat of the prior meeting. That said, I do want to kind of go over the things that were discussed yesterday a little bit, and then open those obviously for questions and further discussion. And since we have a different set of people today, just solicit comments, because quite a bit of yesterday's discussion wasn't exactly stuff that was on the agenda, but questions. So the main three things that we have going on across these release meetings are looking at feature status, test status, and bug or issue status. And yesterday we briefly went over test status. And in the prior meeting, I had intended to make sure that we got a little bit of a run through of test grid put on the agenda, and I forgot about that. So I'm actually going to put that on the agenda right now for next week, so we don't forget it. But in the short term, we have an issue tracking or a test CI signal lead, and their primary tool is what's called testgrid, or testgrid.k8s.io. So that tool is sort of a way to visualize what's going on in the tests. And if you haven't looked at it yet, its UI is interesting and sometimes confusing. So we'll do a little bit of a run through, and the biggest thing is understanding what things you can click on and what information it gives you, and give a walkthrough of kind of how you go through that to find something and make a decision. So we'll probably have Mohammed do that next week. Um, so we briefly discussed that, and he basically gave an update where there's been a few things in failing tests, both for what we call the release blocking master and release blocking upgrade. And he's opened some issues to track those over the last weeks. And the tests were mostly failing around GCI and GKE. But actually, as of yesterday, at the end of the day, things were actually looking a bit better, I would say, and notably better than the prior week. So test is often a little bit of a wiggly wave. You have a failure and somebody notices and you get a fix. So that's not too surprising. But in general, things look relatively clean compared to some prior cycles. The other thing that we talked about then was bugs or issue status. And I keep trying to remember to specifically say bug status instead of issue status, because we, bug means something different than issue, because issue is a thing in GitHub. And in GitHub, we have issues and PRs. And a PR could be implementing a feature or fixing a bug, and you get this sort of weird overlap because the nouns aren't completely clear. So Gwyn is specifically our bug triage lead, and that can involve looking at both issues and PRs. Right now, there wasn't much of anything, and you could glance through the notes if you're interested from yesterday. But more than that, what Gwyn actually did was look at features in the Kubernetes/Kubernetes repo that are targeted for the milestone. Because early in the release, more than creating bugs or filing the PRs to implement things, people are starting to track what feature work they intend to do. So she gave just a little bit of a rundown. There's only a couple of things in the Kubernetes repo that are features. And then from there, we handed off to Kenny Coleman, our feature shadow, because the features are tracked specifically by the features lead and their shadows. And this is a slightly odd split. So for folks who are new, especially the set of shadows today on the call, the Kubernetes repo isn't where feature work is tracked from a planning perspective. There's a separate repo called Kubernetes features. And that feeds into a spreadsheet. And we got off into a fair amount of discussion about spreadsheets then. So the features spreadsheet right now, or the Kubernetes features repo, are tracking, I think, about 23 features. And Stephen and Kenny and the set of feature lead and shadows, they've been reaching out and pinging folks, checking in, like, is this thing actually still on the schedule for 112? What are your plans for testing? What are your plans for documentation? All those sorts of things, doing some initial information collecting. And that's particularly important because if you start out in the Kubernetes features repo at the beginning of the cycle, there's a whole set of stuff that gets labeled for the current release. And if you look through the actual issues, most of them were in the prior release and often in the release before that, so the release before that. So it can almost become sort of a staging ground for hoped for work versus actually going to happen work. So the features leads going out and really poking on folks and asking what is the status of these things helps drive some answers there. And then also that kind of acts as a reminder as you're talking to the SIG leads, hey, what else is there? If there's not just these things that are carrying forward, what other new and interesting work is happening? So the Kubernetes features repo, there have been a number of new issues opened and on top of those, and that's a normal pattern for where we are right now. Let me copy this link. So in the minutes, there's links to each of these things, but there's a link in the Zoom chat to the features spreadsheet if you're interested in giving it a look over. So one of the problems that we typically have on the release team is that we're using GitHub, and whether it's the bug triage, the feature lead, or overall release lead, CI signal, all of us looking at GitHub to try to understand where we are today, It only tells us where we are right now as a point in time. If one of you does a GitHub query and says, hey, look at the first issue, it's really interesting, and I do a GitHub issue, I may not see the same issue. There's new things coming in depending on what query we've done based on labels. If a label's removed, it may no longer show up in the query. So for the release team, we need some sort of persistence in queries, kind of sticky queries where if somebody changes the label, it doesn't disappear from our view. So we may be interested in a particular bug today and be really curious on its status, or a feature that we're a little bit worried about. And if we're only using GitHub for our queries, tomorrow when we come back and try to look for the same thing, the given issue number may no longer be in that query. So what's happened over time, if you go back quite a ways in history, query results were put into markdown files and committed to Git so they were visible to others. Over the more recent releases, these are getting dumped into spreadsheets on GitHub, or sorry, on Google Docs outside of GitHub. But those are all kind of awkward. Like if you have to make a PR, then there's some extra work. It's hard for us to collaborate on a markdown file live versus like a Google Doc, but Google Docs aren't accessible necessarily to everybody in the community. So we've been trying to think about ways to cope with that. And it turns out that the Docs team and Zach Arnold have been playing around with something called Airtable. So there's a whole section in the discussion about that and a link to their little thing. And it's a lot like a spreadsheet, a Google Sheet, but, and maybe I should actually hand this over to Zach since he's on the line today.
I was to say, I wish I could present, but unfortunately I'm on a bus, so I'm just...
Yeah, that's fine. I was mostly just going to speak to it and describe it. Do you want to do that?
You're doing a great job.
Okay, so I just heard about this yesterday. So, and Zach, correct me if I have anything wrong, but the docs team similarly trying to track and make sure, like, hey, does this thing have docs? And if it's an issue or a PR that comes up in a query, they notice it and start thinking, hey, we need to get some docs on that. But it's the end of the day, say. They go home, tomorrow they go and look at their query. They have a vague recollection of there being a new issue, but it's not there. So with this tool, they've got something that's scanning GitHub, noticing new things that are of interest, populating the spreadsheet. So you could sort of think of it as a add only or add mostly spreadsheet, the same as what other folks have been doing lately in Google Sheets. But that way you get sort of persistence. You're scraping GitHub data into a place where you can triage and address it and know that you're not losing things, or you have a better chance of not losing things anyway. So this really caught our attention. Myself having done bug triage and Gwen doing it now, Aish and Mohammed having the CI signal hat on the past and current releases, and I think to some extent also the feature folks were looking at the spreadsheet saying, this is basically what we do also, but maybe a little less lossy, and could we possibly combine it into being sort of like a single pane of glass for the release team, because often our set of spreadsheets overlap in the issues that we're looking at. So we're very intrigued. Zach has kindly volunteered to try to collect some requirements from the rest of us to see if there's things that we could do to make it more generally applicable to the team. And that was most of what we covered yesterday. So with that, I think I want to throw it out to the shadows. Across that sort of stuff, do you have questions or other areas that you have questions? Especially on this tooling front, are there things that folks have used to cope with this from a project management perspective on GitHub, and especially maybe in a large project where you don't have control of, or as much control of who sets what labels and opens and closing of things is under a lot of flux?
I mean, so something we've used in the past with varying success is integrations with product management tools such as Tracker, or I think Trello has an integration as well. Sort of gives you
I've seen
Yeah.
Trello. What was the first one you mentioned?
Tracker, Pivotal Tracker. I don't know if it's very broadly known outside Pivotal. But it essentially has, you have an integration, so you can hook it into your repos, and every time there's a new GitHub issue created, it will create a story or a bug for the team to look at, and that sort of stays there. And then I believe, I might be wrong here, but I believe that any changes that happen on the GitHub issue post-creation end up as comments in that story. So you sort of have some way to get updates from that single point. So that could be an option. Would it be useful to give any more details, or is there anything in specific that you would like to do with these stories or these cards once they get created?
I think the biggest thing for the release team is just to be able to have some persistent view as things are coming and going. And it may also be possible that it's easier for us to cope with notifications. I think a lot of the broader project's problem is you get swamped in notifications, and while you're on the release team, maybe it's a little bit of a more of a focus versus being involved in hundreds and hundreds of development issues going by. Yeah, I'll do a little bit. I'll go do some research on Pivotal Tracker. I've seen Trello and some other things that do cards and boards and planning like that. The one thing that I haven't seen is like this idea of like stickiness. Like, say somebody removes a label, but it's still sort of there for a little bit, so that we would have a way to have certain labels that we're particularly interested in.
And just so keep the labels on the issue, even though somebody has gone and removed them on GitHub? Is that the sort of use case?
Yeah, so say the biggest one would be something's removed from the milestone, and we want to know why, because we're watching it. And a very typical workflow is just to like go from our spreadsheet, be like, hey, that thing's no longer showing up in the query. What changed? And go tunnel into that particular issue or PR on GitHub, and then see milestone label removed. Often you'll see that and no comment or description of why. You ping the person, what happened? Oh, I did that on the wrong issue. Or, oh, we've decided not to do that. And okay, have you communicated that to the other stakeholders, because this other feature was sort of codependent on that, or people were planning on this? We got to talk to the docs folks, let them know to remove things that are staged for the website. All of those sort of follow-on conversations that maybe don't happen if the release team isn't tracking and checking that they happen. And maybe I hesitate to say like adding another label, because there's so many labels and so much effort lately to kind of clean up the big label space. But another way around it would be if the release team had privileges to add and remove a particular label that others didn't, to say like release tracked, but that's just like, why is that different than milestone?
Yeah. That's interesting. Let me know if you need any, if you would like to
I'll do some
work on
reading.
Tracker.
Okay. In the meantime, we have this whole shadow world of spreadsheet-ish things, and it does actually work. And even if there's some duplication across the different leads, at times that's also been helpful, because one of the big benefits of the release team is just a good set of eyes, and across that diversity, somebody notices something and brings it up. Oh, and I didn't mention one other thing, and this only minimally came up, and then it kind of followed on in conversation. So there's a third place where features are tracked, just to keep things exciting, and this third place is actually becoming in places, unfortunately, for the release team. So going back maybe a year or more, I'm not sure how long, but for quite some time, the SIG cluster lifecycle folks working on kubeadm, they have their own repo, Kubernetes/kubeadm, and they have issues there that indicate features and are labeled with milestones as well. Generally, they're kind of off on, I wouldn't say off on the side exactly, but they're off in their space doing their thing, and it's worked fine. We mostly coordinate with them towards the end as we're getting ready to release and trying to make sure that release artifacts line up, because the kubeadm tool manages deployment configuration of clusters. And to do that, it downloads artifacts and installs them on cluster nodes. So it needs to know when new releases come out, understand where those artifacts are to consume and push them out. So a little bit of kind of integration coordination happens there with the kubeadm folks, but that's not necessarily like feature tracking or deployment. So they've done a pretty good job of doing that themselves and communicating also with the docs team on their features, especially in the last release. That seems to have gone really well. But this is a trend that's coming across the project. If you've heard people talk about splitting the monolith, everything used to be in Kubernetes, and now there's starting to be other repositories. And this potentially becomes a friction point or a concern for the release team. Do we only focus on the core? How much do we pay attention to the other repos? And I think the release team disregards those other repos to our peril, because these are all interconnected. A lot of people are, if kubeadm, for example, is the tool for deployment, there's coupling there. It's gonna, if nothing else, just the way it downloads artifacts. But each of these things, if they're releasing on their own cadence, we need to understand where they are and what risk is implied on the core, and do they destabilize us when it comes to doing end-to-end tests? When do we upgrade their version number and all of our configuration, and do we destabilize them? So this is going to be a whole added dimension, I think, of coordination that needs to happen increasingly in the future. And it probably won't just be across the release team, but across the whole project. People are going to need to talk and coordinate more. And testing is one area that's been on my mind lately. I'm not sure if folks have heard of or followed the cloud provider splitting. It's one of the early areas where the infrastructure as a service that sits under Kubernetes, those things are being broken out, the provider glue code into separate repositories. We've now got a SIG cloud provider. But as you do that, where does testing happen? And right now, a large portion of the testing is happening with Kubernetes on GCE, but that's kind of homogeneous, and there's a whole bunch of other options out there. We should have good CI/CD on those as well. And the big hope there for the release team is you get some A/B testing. Instead of test status being red, test status is maybe red on, say, I'll pick on myself, on VMware, but it's good on Pivotal and good on GCE. Well, then we as a release team know, okay, the core is probably okay. We need to go talk to the VMware people and figure out what's going on their platform. So this will be a really useful tool to the release team once it's implemented, but it's going to take some time to get all of that implemented, and it's an early days discussion. So in the meantime, we have some of that splitting and possibly lack of coverage, increased risk.
Are you seeing signs at the moment of the split happening? Is there something worrying you right now?
The main thing is the testing. And it's maybe not so much of a new risk, because that depends on how much coverage we have. So like from the cloud provider perspective, if most of the testing today is on GCE, well, the other cloud providers are existing risk. So we're not going to get as immediate feedback on those. And then I guess there I can have hope, because we're actually building towards a better future that will have good CI. There's a later in an hour, or no, it's sometime in a couple hours, got to look at the calendar. The next SIG testing meeting, there's going to be some discussion of this and the cloud provider testing options. So it's good, the conversations are going, things are improving. I'll throw that back at you all. What are things that you would be concerned about as things start splitting out and tracking and coordinating? Like, you got the classic software engineering integration is hard. Like, but what are some specific things that you've bumped into that you might worry about here in the Kubernetes case? Anything?
I mean, for me, not so much a concern as it is a question as to whether the current process will still be applicable or what tweaks, if any, that will need to be done. But yeah.
Yeah, I think from the releasing perspective, like if we're focused on releasing Kubernetes, that becomes much more of a project release cadence where to some extent right now, it feels more like a distribution because we have if you look at the documentation, there's a big set of dependencies, and at a minimum, you need etcd, right, to run Kubernetes, but there's a big tail of other things and at specific versions, and it starts feeling much more like a distribution where there's a set of integrated things. It may be that we need to do some changes to more explicitly think like a distribution and try to enhance the areas where right now we're even maybe more actively just focusing on the Kubernetes repo, that we do proactively think bigger. I'm curious to interact more as time goes by with those doing distributions, because I'm not sure if you all have seen this. There's a spreadsheet of Kubernetes distributions and vendors. I think the CNCF maintains this. I'll drop it in the chat. There are, as of today, 67 vendors of Kubernetes, 74 products, 24 hosted platforms, and 42 distributions.
Not bad, eh?
Yeah. So
Wow.
those 42 entities making distributions of Kubernetes, it would be really interesting to have like a BOF at one of the conferences and talk about release process. How are we all managing this? For those, if they're sort of downstream of us in a way, is the core release team declaring 1.12, are there things that they would like us to be doing that would make their lives easier? Are there things that they could tell us that, hey, don't worry about those, we're going to always do those ourselves? It could be really informative. And I didn't start the meeting with saying that this is liable to be a shorter meeting. Our meeting yesterday, I think, was about a half hour. This time in the cycle, it's usually just sort of this type of lightweight status and then some discussion. So. Well, the floor is open for any other questions or comments. Carrie, Etienne, Arnaud, anything that you'd like to ask, find out about?
I think I'm good for now. I mean, I'm just kind of chiming in until it's time for me to get to work, you know, just hanging out and watching.
Uh-huh. Well, if there isn't anything else, I hope this was informative to kind of get a little bit of chat time, even though part of it was just kind of a super lightweight recap of some of the stuff discussed yesterday. Maria, I appreciate the mention of the pivotal tracker. I'm going to go look at that and think about it. And next week, we should have a run through of test grid. All right. Well, thanks everybody for attending, and have a good day.
You too.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye.